On July 24th, 2020, Charlesonian and Luke Empire soldiers clashed over the control of Fort Stylin. This battle occurred as a result of rising tensions between the Luke Empire, later renamed Lopad, and the Charles Confederacy. It all started when Charlesonia annexed Lopad. At this point in time, the empire was extremely small and only had two members, Luke and Jagged Cake. Luke and Jagged quickly came to an agreement to make a bid for their independence, which was successful. No blood was shed during this time, yet it increased hostility between the two factions. This was later followed by the Lopad capital city getting griefed by Coley the Cat. This was the last straw for many Lopadians, and they immediately voted to declare war. A few skirmishes were fought, but the first consequential battle was over the control of the extremely important Lopad Fort Stylin. The battle was the bloodiest and most consequential in the server's history. It eventually led to Lopad's defeat and rapid decline. More importantly, however, it led to the rise of the United World Powers and the constant fighting between Lopad and Charlesonia. It makes one beg the question, what if Lopad won the Battle of Stylin? Let's first establish how Lopadians would have gone about winning the battle. The Lopadians suffered from a lack of good communication. If better communication with Lopad's spy, Intertoad, had been secured, Lopad would have an extra player at the start of the battle. Lopad also suffered from diverting men to take out the beds, when Intertoad already had. Had better communication been secured, it is likely Lopad would have won the battle. Now with Lopad's victory, it puts Charles into a terrible strategic position. Charles' forces would have to retreat to Fort Dank, a fort that has poor defenses and a fort that has been trashed by Lopad raiders for months on end. Lopad morale at this time would skyrocket, and because of such, the Luke Empire riots would have never occurred, meaning the player base would stay extremely high. Charlesonian forces would mount a brave defense, but would ultimately be routed. Now with spawn secured, Lopad would have a steady stream of players flowing in, making Lopad population reach astronomical heights. Charles would be beat back again and again until eventually they had their backs to the wall and were besieged at their capital city. The siege would be led by General Pug of Lopad and would continue for several weeks. Fearing the end, real XD Lucas would betray Charlesonia and let the Lopadians into the city. The capital fell within minutes. Jace, Brobafett, and a few others rode out of the city heading for Roma. They just barely escaped capture. When they arrived at Roma with the hospitality of Whaleke, they were able to set up a government in exile, where they could plot their next moves and do their best to hinder Lopad interests. However, the war was as good as over. Lopad sliced up Charlesonia into 3 district zones, the first being all holdouts near or with a 500-block radius of spawn. These territories would be governed by Jagged Cake. The second zone would be the capital and all buildings surrounding it. This area would be overseen by General Pug. And finally, all remaining buildings and outposts scattered throughout the world would be governed by Toad and Bob. The Lopad War Council voted on harsh terms. Charlesonians would be forced to complete an hour of service in Lopad mines every week, and the Charles government would be forced to give 300 diamonds a month to Lopad as tribute. In addition to this, Charlesonians could not own any armor or weapons. Over the ensuing months, Lopad dealt with increasingly hostile attacks from the government in exile headquartered at Roma. Jason Company took out a Lopadian patrol force and stole 10 stacks of diamonds. In response, Luke Prod demanded 500 diamonds a month as tribute, and increased the time in the mines from 1 hour to 3. After this, things went rather well for the Luke Empire. Attacks from the exiled government slowed down and eventually reached a halt. Yet there was still one problem, Roma. To ensure peace and lasting stability, Roma had to be crushed. Roma was harboring war fugitives and the leader of Charlesonia himself, Jace. Luke sent frequent delegations to Roma, for the fugitives to be traded for a cash sum, but all such offers were refused. Lopad and Roma went to war. Lopad sent troops into Roma, and they occupied the east side of the city. With this under control, the Luke Empire used this as a leverage to get Wale to surrender. You see, Wale cared much for his city, as he largely built it himself, and it was quite a beautiful city. He would rather surrender than abandon his city. He sent supplies with the refugee Charlesonians, and they fled to Denkis. Roma fell and was made into the 4th Lopad district, overseen by Noob Titan. Guards were posted at the city to ensure nothing happened to it, as was agreed in the surrender terms. At this point in time, Season 7 was coming to a close. To sum up, Lopad won the Spawn War and subjugated Charlesonia. Roma fell, and Denkis was the only independent faction left on the map. However, that would not last for long. The government in exile at Charlesonia and Roman leadership would gather in secret meetings, plotting they could overthrow and destroy Lopad if they could just manage to combine all of their forces at the beginning of Season 8. Charlesonia and Roma managed to get an incredibly reluctant Denkis to join in on their plans. Finally, Season 8 had ended. The factions of Denkis, Roma, and Charlesonia had initiated their plot to destroy Lopad once and for all. All three moved and headed to a region which they could all travel to and from each of their main bases easily. Lopad was a major distance from them, which made it difficult for Lopad to reach them and vice versa. These three factions all formed an alliance, which would go down by the name of the Charles Coalition, united under the cause of the destruction of the Luke Empire. However, this wouldn't be known by Lopad until much later, in which this plot would be discovered, but as of now, these three main factions would progress as usual. Lopad moved a great distance and had a massive amount of members, comparable to that of Charlesonia, Roma, and Denkis combined. In a few weeks' time, all three factions would be geared up with diamond armor and tools. Following this, small tensions would begin to rise between Lopad and Charlesonia over the Spawn region. This time around, they had decided to split it. Lopad had sent General Pug to govern over their slice of the Spawn region. However, tensions would rise over border conflicts between how far these parts of the Spawn region would extend. This would end up in what would be called the Fort Bend Incident, in which Lopad and Charlesonia members would have a skirmish over this border conflict. This only worsened relations between both factions. However, Charlesonia chose to cede the territory rather than to go to war. They decided that the Charles Coalition was not yet ready for war, seeing as Lopad had better enchantments, and gear in general, as Charlesonia had trouble gearing up for all of their members. Not only that, but Lopad had greater membership than them. Luke Productions found it rather strange Charlesonia didn't go into full-out war, and that there were also Denkis members stationed at Fort Bend that also partook in the skirmish. He decided to have a spy sent into Charlesonia to see if anything was amongst these two factions, seeing as Denkis had gone neutral in Season 7 during the Spawn War. He decided to have a relatively new member pretend to leave Lopad, and asked to conscript with Charlesonia, this member being Slack. He would conscript with Charlesonia and inform Luke on everything going on. However, the Charles Coalition plot would not be uncovered until a couple weeks later, as Slack had to gain the trust of Charlesonian upper command before being let in on anything. Eventually, the plot was uncovered and Slack informed Luke Productions. He wasn't too astounded by the revelation, as he had suspected something of the sort was going on. Luke Productions chose not to immediately go to war, but rather wait a week or two to maybe find out what their battle plans for the war just were. After they were uncovered, Luke Productions staged an incident in Spawn, which he used to justify for the declaration of war, to make it seem as Charlesonia provoked it, making it seem like they were the true aggressors. And that is where we will leave off for now. Tune in next week for part 2 of this series. Let us know in the comments section what you think would have happened had Lopad won the Battle of Stylin. We appreciate you watching this far, and God bless.